Good evening, Dr. Trimmer. My name is Michael Alexander, and I'll be providing you a data overview for Chapel Hill Middle School. We'll be looking at the Georgia Milestone data for 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, for ELA, math, social studies, science, as well as MAP data and attendance data for Chapel Hill Middle School. The data that we're using, it was the Georgia Milestone, which is the Georgia equivalent to the Park Assessment. It's given to students in April, and basically the levels of performance are level 4, which is for the distinguished learners. Level 3 is for proficient learners, and then level 2 is developing learners, and level 1 is basically beginning learners. So if you look at the data, you're able to see the 6th grade students on the ELA portion of the Georgia Milestone. They're basically fared where 1.4% of the students were considered developing, 25.5% of the students were considered proficient, which is a little bit over about 26, close to 27% of the students were either proficient or distinguished. Or unfortunately, if you look at the data, you see 30.9% of the students were considered beginning learners, and I'm sorry, 30.9% of the students were considered developing learners, and 54.6% of the students were considered beginning learners. The math data for the 6th grade was very much on par with the ELA data. It was only 1% of the students basically were considered a distinguished learner. 9.2% of the students were considered proficient learners. 35.9% were considered developing learners, and 53.9% of the students were considered beginning learners. So if you look at the math 6th grade data, you're able to see that almost 90% of the students are either developing or beginning, which means those particular students are either 1 or 2 or multiple grade levels behind. Transitioning to 7th grade, our 7th grade data, it's a little bit better than our 6th grade data, but we still have a lot of work to do. We have about 5.2% of the students who were considered distinguished learner on the Georgia Milestone ELA assessment, and 25% of the student population were considered proficient learners. Once we transition over to developing learners, we had about 30.3% of the students that were considered developing learners, and 39% of the students were considered beginning learners, which means about 69% of our population are either 1 to 2 or multiple grade levels behind. The math data for 7th grade, we had 4.2% of the students that were considered distinguished learners, and 25.4% of the students were considered proficient learners. We had 30.3% of the students were considered developing, and 39% of the students were considered beginning learners. 8th grade. 8th grade trended a little bit higher than the other 2 grade levels. So almost 30% of the students that fell within the category of proficient or distinguished, which 4.2% were considered distinguished, and 25.4% were considered proficient. You had about 39% of the students were considered to be developing learners, and 30.7% of the students were considered to be beginning learners. The pie just kind of shifted, and the colors just changed a little bit. I want to say we have more developing learners than beginning learners for the 8th grade population, but just overall we still fell within that 69%, almost 70% of our students within the 8th grade population, or either 1 to 2 or more grade levels behind. In math, we had about 7.7%, which was probably the largest percentage of students that were considered distinguished learners in all 3 grade levels. 16.5% of the students were considered proficient learners. But then on the flip end, you had 38.1% of the students were considered developing learners, and 37.7% of the students were considered beginning learners, which still means that pretty much almost 75% of our students fell within the category of beginning and developing, meaning that they are 1 to 2 or multiple grade levels behind. The MAP data, if you look at the MAP data for Chapel Hill Middle School, and it basically is an assessment that was pretty much administered in the fall and in the winter. So based off of the data, it correlates very, very, very much to the Georgia Milestone data. You're able to see where you had 90% of the students in the fall that were not on grade level in math. And when you look at ELA for the fall, you had about 75% of the students that were not on grade level. If you look at the winter assessment, it was about almost 90% of the students that were not on grade level in mathematics, as well as about 75% of the students that were not on grade level in the winter in reading and ELA. The comparison. So my comparison for the Georgia Milestone was between Chapel Hill Middle School and Peachtree Charter Middle School, and the reason that I chose Peachtree Charter Middle School was due to the fact that these were 2 middle schools that I was selected to interview to be the principal, so I had historical data as well as current data on both programs, so I was able to do somewhat of a comparison. Now, looking at Peachtree Charter Middle School proficiency score, and these were students that are considered either proficient or distinguished learners. Peachtree Charter Middle School in 2017 had 51.34% of their students that were considered proficient or distinguished learners, compared to 30% at Chapel Hill Middle School. If you look at the 2018 data, 57.16% of the students at Peachtree Charter Middle School were considered distinguished or proficient learners, where only 22.31% of the students at Chapel Hill Middle School fell within this category. The Georgia Milestone science data basically correlates to the ELA and math data. If you look at the beginning students, is about almost 50% of the students fell within the beginning category, where 28.9% of the students fell within the developing category, and it was only probably about 21% that were considered proficient or either distinguished learners, being 17.6 being proficient, and 3.9 of the students were considered distinguished learners on the science Georgia Milestone for 8th grade. For social studies for 8th grade, it was 42.8% of the students were considered beginning learners, 36.7 were considered developing learners, 14.8 were considered proficient learners, and only 5.7% of the students were considered distinguished learners, according to the 8th grade Georgia Milestone Social Studies Assessment. The Chapel Hill Middle School attendance data. The reason I chose attendance data was due to the fact that I feel like attendance drives achievement. If a student's not in school, they're not sitting in the classroom, they're not engaged in rigorous instruction, it's no way that they're going to perform well on the end of the year assessment. So I wanted to look at the attendance data from 2015 to 2018, and based off of the data, I wanted to be able to see was there a correlation between students who were in school who scored well versus students who missed 10 or more days and were not in school and potentially were considered either a beginning learner or a developing learner. So if you look at the data, you notice from 2015 to 2018, Chapel Hill went from an 83% in-seat attendance to an 84% in-seat attendance to an 81% in-seat attendance, and then it has dropped down to probably a 76% in-seat attendance, meaning in 2018, 24% of the students were absent 10 or more days. So that is alarming. That could potentially be a reason for why the students are not performing the way they should be performing on the Georgia Milestone, because they missed a lot of instructional time. The instructional focus. So based on the deep dive into the Georgia Milestone data and MAP formative assessment data, the instructional goals or focus for Chapel Hill Middle School will be both reading slash ELA and math. The data shows that across all grade levels, students struggle in both literacy and numeracy. The instructional focus strategies that we would use to improve our ELA achievement data would be the incorporation of close reading across all content areas. All teachers will be trained on close reading to ensure that we are implementing the strategy with fidelity. In addition to close reading, will be the incorporation of reading interventions such as Read 180 and System 44. In math, our math teachers will implement a problem-solving strategy that focuses on constructing written arguments to justify students' mathematical decisions. Teachers will use accountable talk in order to promote math discourse, and then math intervention classes using iReady and Math 180 will potentially be infused into the extended literacy period. Information needed to identify the learner center problem. So I think the information that I would potentially use or potentially need to be able to just have a better understanding of why our school is where it is academically is to have student level data for the Georgia Milestone to be able to look at what standards our students didn't really score well on. Also the MAP data, because the MAP data would also provide a report or whether the student needs the most support. I would like to compare attendance data with the achievement data, which would provide me a context of how student attendance impacts student achievement. So looking at our students that fell within that beginning and developing category, and then cross-referencing their attendance data to see was that group of students, the group of students who missed 10 or more days, and what can we do to ensure that those students are in school to be able to support our instructional program, and just to support the families in general. I think we can analyze intervention data of students just to determine if the students were provided a intervention and what intervention was used to support both math and ELA. And then if students were provided an intervention, was the intervention targeted based on students' needs, or were interventions provided without targeting students' area of deficiencies? So this is some of the work that we will continue to have to do. I'll be meeting with my entire leadership team on Tuesday. We'll be doing a retreat, and I actually will potentially use this presentation to kind of show them where we are as a school, and so we can brainstorm and collaborate on the strategies and the game plan that we need to implement to be able to move the school forward. So in essence, this project that I'm doing for GW to complete my EDS is going to support me in the work that I'll be doing as a first year principal in DeKalb County Public Schools, and as the first year as the principal of Chapel Hill Middle School. I want to thank you for allowing me to analyze my school data, because it's real, and I'm very, very invested in this particular data, because it's the data that I'm going to be held accountable for as the principal of the school, and I will be able to create my comprehensive school improvement plan based off of the work that we'll be doing within this class and some of the research that I'll be doing within the classroom, within this particular class, to support the work that I need to do throughout the school year. So I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to me present this information, and I will send a copy of the presentation via email, as well as try to upload this video recording of the presentation. I want to thank you and have a great evening.